Today we're talking about climate change and the Constitution. The Australian constitutional system is meant to endure for centuries, but if climate change gets out of control, this will be increasingly difficult. For example, food and water insecurity may make judges and politicians vulnerable to corruption. Governments cannot run smoothly if fires, floods, disease and more escalate, and tensions between states may emerge as resources diminish. In short, climate change threatens the long-term structural integrity of our constitutional system. If the ecosystem falls apart, so too does this constitutional system built within it. So what should lawyers duty-bound to protect our constitution do? We could do nothing, but that would mean leaving government action worsening climate change to continue threatening our constitutional system. We could rely on existing political avenues available under the Constitution, such as protests, elections and parliamentary debate, to seek better climate laws and policies. We can also use existing environmental laws in court. These avenues remain important, but over 30 years have not been enough to adequately push government. Australia continues to rank among the world's worst climate actors. Our governments have purposefully kept our environmental laws weak to accommodate mining and other ecologically harmful industries. After over 30 years, time is now running out. We're on the brink of unleashing runaway climate change, where the planet starts getting hotter of its own volition and our ability to stop collapse slips away. More options are needed. So what about amending the Constitution? The framers did not include provisions protecting the environment in our Constitution. This is unlike most nations in the world who have often gone on to use these provisions to tackle climate wrongdoing. For example, the Netherlands Constitution has a provision that requires authorities to keep the country habitable and to protect and improve the environment. In the Agenda case, the Dutch court used this provision to help establish that their government had a duty of care to take stronger climate action. In Australian constitutional law, with no environmental protection provisions, climate change has only been addressed indirectly. In Vanderstock, for example, the High Court held that a state tax on electric cars was unconstitutional. Cheaper electric cars is a climate win, but the court's decision was not made for environmental reasons. The state tax was invalid merely because this was the Commonwealth's taxing domain. This is one of the few climate change cases that has happened in constitutional law, and climate change, as I said, was only an indirect discussion point. So adding environmental protection provisions to our constitution could help, but referendums in Australia are near impossible. There is a final option that I want to propose. The High Court could find a limit on government action worsening climate change implied in the Constitution. We can call this the implied right to a healthy environment, also known as the ecological limitation. How is this possible? Well, the court has found many implied limits on government power over the years. Its view is that the Constitution implicitly forbids government action damaging things that our constitutional system needs to function. Look at the implied freedom of political communication, for example. The Constitution makes no explicit mention of free speech, but our constitutional system needs people to be able to speak freely on politics so that parliament, elections, etc. can run effectively. Thus, the court held that our Constitution implicitly forbids the Commonwealth and states from compromising people's free political speech. For example, in the 2017 Bob Brown case, a Tasmanian law restricting protests in certain forest areas was held to be invalid because it breached the implied freedom of political communication. The implied right to a healthy environment could follow a similar formula to the implied freedom of speech. Just like free political speech, our constitutional system needs a healthy environment. The Constitution, therefore, may implicitly forbid the Commonwealth and states from compromising this environment. To tease this out, let's consider a hypothetical case. Let's say government approves a new coal mine. If the implied right to a healthy environment was established, this government approval could be seen as breaching this implied right. Why? Because a new coal mine would release a lot of carbon, fueling climate change and thus hurting our constitutional system in the long run. As leading Australian climate scientist Will Steffen explains, there's no room left in the carbon budget for new coal mines. Of course, some objections may be made to this argument. One might argue that one coal mine does not single-handedly destroy our constitutional system. But this is not how implied limits work. No breach of an implied limit single-handedly destroys our constitution. For example, the Tasmanian law restricting logging protesters in the Bob Brown case did not come close to single-handedly destroying our constitution. The court was sensitive, however, to how such actions might incrementally or partially hurt our system. This was enough for it to be deemed in breach of the implied freedom of speech. Another counter-argument may be made that the economic benefits of a new coal mine must be taken into account. I would agree with this. The High Court formulates some implied limits with a proportionality test for this reason. This test basically requires the court to permit the government to do what it wishes if it's for some benefit that's worth the potential damage to the Constitution. With a new coal mine, its economic benefits might have to be quite spectacular to be worth this risk. A further counter-argument might be made that the implied right to a healthy environment would require judges to be too political. For example, judges may have to make economic value judgments regarding the mine when doing this proportionality test. One problem with this, however, is that such value judgments on not just economics, but national security and other politically charged areas are already often made by judges in constitutional law. A further point is that judges are the guardians of our constitution and watchdog of the government. Government action fueling climate change threatens our constitution. It would be a dereliction of the court's duty not to intervene. So to summarize, the implied right to a healthy environment is a proposed limit implied in the Constitution that would invalidate climate-damaging government action unless this action is proportionate. While establishing this constitutional implication undoubtedly faces challenges, some of its strengths are worth noting. One strength is that the argument for an implied right to a healthy environment is based on the existing text and structure of the document and existing precedent on how implied limits work. This means it could be taken to court now. You don't need to put this in the Constitution. My argument is that this implication might already be there. Another strength is that the Constitution is the one law above government that they must obey. This is different from environmental protection legislation, which Australian governments often rewrite and weaken whenever it gets in their way. The Constitution is the one law that they cannot scrap. So let's conclude. Big societal crises like World War II, the Cold War, and the GFC have often been the catalyst for discovering things buried in our Constitution. Climate change is such a crisis. It makes us confront what has always been the reality, that our constitutional system needs a healthy ecosystem to continue. We can't do nothing. Adding environmental protection provisions to the Constitution is near impossible. We must keep using the political and legal avenues available, but more is needed. An implied right to a healthy environment would be a valuable additional tool. The argument for the implied right will only become more obvious over time as climate change hits harder. But the sooner we recognize this, the better able we will be to do our job as lawyers of passing on a healthy constitutional system to future generations.